Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. I'm glad you're here. Most of the stories we tell on this channel have a moment you can point to. A message on a phone, a face at an airport that doesn't match the photo, a bank transfer that clears and then a number goes silent. Something specific and visible you can show people and say, there. That's where it went wrong. This one doesn't have that. Or it does, but it's not what you'd expect. Today's story is about a man named Seamus Connolly. He's 47, he's from Limerick in Ireland, and he spent most of his working life driving lorries up and down the N7. Not a flashy man, not a reckless one. The kind of man who checks his mirrors, keeps his logbook, doesn't say anything until he's sure of what he's saying. He came to Vietnam the way a lot of men come to Vietnam, carrying something he didn't have the vocabulary for yet, and he did something before he arrived, something he thought was sensible, something that was supposed to keep him safe. I won't tell you what it is quite yet. What I'll tell you is that it didn't work the way he planned. And what happened because of it, in the back of a taxi, on an ordinary Thursday morning, is one of the more quietly devastating things we've heard on this channel. This one's going to stay with you. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I want to start with the N7, because if you don't understand the N7, you don't understand me. The N7 is the main road between Limerick and Dublin. About 200 kilometers Dublin, motorway for most of it, then it opens out a bit near the city. I drove that road, or variations of it, for 22 years. Furniture, building materials, dry goods, refrigerated stuff when they needed a second driver on a cold run. Whatever needed moving from one place to the other. I was the man who moved it. People think long-haul driving is lonely work. It isn't, not really. Or it is technically, in that there's no one else in the cab. But lonely implies you want something you haven't got. I didn't want anything. I had the radio, I had my own thoughts, I had the road, 8, 9, 10 hours, and I'd be completely fine. Better than fine, actually. I think better when I'm moving and I've got something practical to do. I always have. My back ended that L4, L5 disc, if you want the medical terminology. Which I don't, particularly, but there it is. One morning, loading at a depot outside Nas, I bent the wrong way, picking up something that wasn't even heavy, and that was that. Surgery. Then 18 months of physiotherapy that mostly worked, but not quite enough. Then a letter from a doctor and a form from the department and a pension that was enough to live on, if you were careful and didn't do anything interesting. I was 44. My back was 44. Everything else felt older. And then Sandra. I'm not going to go through all of it. 16 years, 2 kids, Ciaran, 19 now, and Aoi Fei. She's 16, good kids, both of them, though we're not exactly close at the minute. That's its own thing. We had the house in Castle Troy, which I'd been paying the mortgage on since before Ciaran was born, and various bits of savings and a car and the ordinary accumulation of a life. And then Brendan, that's her solicitor, Brendan, gray suit, soft hands, never driven anything heavier than a Volkswagen Golf in his life. Brendan made sure that the house and most of the savings went with Sandra, which is probably what the law intended, and is possibly even fair. And I'm not going to pretend I handled it gracefully because I didn't. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning. Kitchen table, Sandra and I sitting across from each other with 2 mugs of tea, neither of us drank. She looked tired. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just... Not triumphant, not vindictive, just tired. Which I found harder than if she'd looked angry, if I'm honest. Anger you can work with. By Friday I was looking at flights, not because of any plan. I want to be clear about that. I had no plan. I had a disability pension. A lump sum from the settlement that was less than it should have been, but more than nothing. And a bedsit and door-doyle that I'd rented, furnished. Because I had no furniture. Because the furniture had been in the house. 4 walls, a 2-ring hob, a window that looked out onto the car park of a little. I've slept in worse truck stops, but I'd chosen those. There was a fella on a trucking forum I'd been on for years. Geordie called Phil, drove HGVs out of Newcastle for 20 years before he packed it in. Good lad, we'd never met in person, but you know people from forums, you get a sense of them. The previous winter he'd posted photos from Ho Chi Minh City, a rooftop bar somewhere. Cold beer, a plate of something that looked like a filled roll. The city going out to the horizon in the dark with all the lights on. He looked like a man who'd put something down that he'd been carrying. I asked him about it in the comments. Just, what's it like? Is it worth going? And he wrote back, Phil, he said, Seamus, mate, your money goes forever here, and nobody knows who you were back home. The second part of that, nobody knows who you were back home. I don't know if he meant it the way I heard it. Probably he just meant it as a selling point. Cheap beer and anonymity, the usual stuff. But I sat in that bedsit reading it on my phone at about 11 at night, the little car park lit up orange outside the window, and I thought, right, yeah, I can see the value in that. 3 weeks later, I booked the flights. I told myself it was just the sun. And here's the thing I haven't told anyone, not Phil, not anyone on the forum, not a single person I know from home. Starting about a month after I signed the divorce papers, I started learning Vietnamese, not in a class. On my own, in the bedsit, on YouTube and an app and a cheap notebook I bought at a Centra. I did it in the evenings mostly. Tones, vocabulary, basic phrases. Vietnamese is tonal, which means the same syllable, means 5 or 6 completely different things depending on how you pitch it. And my ear for that was, well, it was a work in progress, still is. But I stuck at it for 4 months before I got on the plane. I told myself it was preparation, which it was, partly. But if I'm being straight about it, and that's what this is, being straight, it was also something to do between 6 and 10 in the evening that wasn't just sitting there listening to the little car park and thinking about Sandra looking tired across the kitchen table. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want to look foolish if it came to nothing. That's a very Irish thing, I think. You don't announce intentions. You wait until you can show the result. And I wasn't good enough yet to show anything. So I kept it to myself, and I kept at it. And 4 months later, I got on a plane to Vietnam with a notebook full of tones I couldn't quite hear yet, and the particular silence of a man who had stopped waiting to feel better and decided to go somewhere else instead. Whether that was brave or stupid, I still haven't fully worked out. Maybe both. Probably both. That's where this starts anyway. Dooradoyle. The little car park. Tuesday to Friday, papers to plane ticket, and a Geordie on a forum who had no idea what he was setting in motion. Tien Sin. And this at 6 in the morning smells like jet fuel. And something frying, and the specific staleness of recycled air coming out of a building that hasn't had its filters changed recently enough. I know that's a strange thing to notice first, but I notice smells. 22 years in a lorry cab, you learn to read air quality. You know when something's off before you can see it. I got through arrivals in about 40 minutes, collected my bag, walked through the sliding doors, and the heat hit me like someone had opened a very large oven. Not aggressive heat, not like I'd imagined it. I'd imagined something punishing, something that would make me want to go back inside. It wasn't like that. It was more like the air had weight to it. Warm and dense, and already full of exhaust and something sweet underneath that I couldn't identify yet. Jasmine, maybe. Or some food I didn't have a name for. You've got touts, and official ranks, and grab, and every option requires a decision. And I'd been on a plane for 11 hours, and I was in no state for decisions. I'd pre-booked through the guest house, which turned out to be the right call. A man with a small handwritten sign, with my name spelled wrong, Shamus, which I didn't bother correcting. He drove me into the city through traffic that appeared to operate on principles I couldn't discern, lanes being more of a suggestion. Motorbikes flowing around us in every direction, like water around a stone. Horns used not aggressively but conversationally, as a kind of continuous ambient language. I sat in the back and watched it and didn't say a word. The whole journey. The guest house was on a narrow street just off Bien Lane Market in District 1. 3 stories, tiled floors, a reception desk staffed by a young woman who spoke very precise English and handed me a key card and told me the Wi-Fi password was written on a card in the room. Small room, clean, a ceiling fan that clicked on every third rotation like it had a slight wobble. It had learned to live with. I lay down on the bed fully clothed and stared at the ceiling and listened to the city outside and thought, right, here I am then. I spent the first 3 days doing nothing ambitious. I walked. I ate. I sat outside places and drank things and watched the street. The cheapness of everything was real, and I want to be precise about this because people talk about it in vague terms, and vague terms don't help anyone. A full breakfast, eggs and bread, and coffee and fruit, at a place 2 streets from the guest house, 40,000 dong. That's about €1.50. A 333 beer at a plastic stool place on the footpath near the market, 25,000 dong. Less than €1. A grab across the city, say, District 1 to District 3, 20 minutes in normal traffic, 60 or 70,000 dong. A couple of €50 at most. I know what things cost in Limerick. A pint of Guinness is €6 on a good day, and closer to 7 in most places. The comparison was, it took some adjusting to, I'll say that. The anonymity was real too. In Limerick, I cannot buy a sandwich without running into someone who has an opinion about my divorce. I'm not exaggerating. It's a city, technically, but it's a city that behaves like a town, and a town that behaves like a town, and a town that behaves like a village depending on which part you're in. And the part one was in was the village end. Here, nobody knew me. I was just a large, quiet Irish fella with a slightly wrong gait from the back, moving slowly through a city that had absolutely no interest in who I'd been or what had happened to me. That felt, I don't have a better word for it, it felt medicinal. Like being in a place where the air didn't carry anything about you. I met some of the other expats in the guest house common room over those first days. There was a Canadian man, retired teacher, mid-60s, who'd been in Saigon for 3 years, and had the look of a man who had either achieved profound peace or was very far from home and had stopped noticing. I couldn't tell which. We had a perfectly pleasant conversation about the traffic and the food, and whether the heat got easier. He said it did, which I now know is partly true and partly something people say to feel like they've adapted to something. There was a group of younger lads visiting from Singapore for a long weekend, very interested in the nightlife situation, not particularly interested in anything I had to say. That was fine. I kept to myself mostly. I walked. I ate singam tum for the first time, broken rice with a pork chop and pickled vegetables and a fried egg, at a plastic stool place on V Dom Tine, and thought it was one of the better things I'd eaten in years, and I've had good food. I know what a decent meal is. The Vietnamese. I should mention the Vietnamese, because it matters later. I'd been at it for 4 months by the time I landed. My comprehension was better than my speaking. That tends to be the way with languages, I think. Your ear develops faster than your mouth. I could follow a conversation if it was practical, and didn't move too fast, and the speaker wasn't using too much slang. I couldn't have held a complicated conversation, but I was aware, let's say, more aware than most tourists. I kept that to myself, for the reasons I mentioned. It was preparation. It was also, I think now, something to do with my hands, something to keep occupied so the evenings didn't just become a long sit in the silence of Dordogne. Both things can be true at the same time. About 3 weeks in, I found a travel blog that mentioned the cafe district around Levine Chron in District 3. Good coffee, the blog said. Less touristy than the places around Bien Chon. The blog was right, as it happened. I booked a grab on the Thursday afternoon and sat in the back watching the city change texture as we moved from District 1 into District 3. The streets getting narrower and greener. The overhead power lines tangling more impressively between buildings. A woman selling banh mi from a cart on the footpath calling out without particularly expecting anyone to stop. The driver was a wiry man in his mid-50s named Min Shu, small religious medallion on the rearview mirror, St. Christopher, or Vietnamese equivalent. I wasn't sure. His English was slightly formal in the way of a man who'd learned it from a long series of foreign passengers over many years, grammatically careful, certain words slightly emphasized at the wrong point in a sentence. Voluble. In other circumstances, I'd have found him draining. That afternoon, for reasons I couldn't have explained at the time, I didn't. He asked the standard questions. Where was I from? Was it my first time in Vietnam? Did I have family here? I gave the standard short answers. Ireland, first time, no family. He filled the gaps with observations about the city. This street had flooded badly in the last rains. That new building going up used to be a noodle shop he liked. I found myself listening properly, which I don't always do with strangers. He had the manner of a man who is genuinely interested in things, which is rarer than it sounds. Near the end of the ride, he mentioned his niece, The way you mentioned something in passing, not pushed, not built up to. She works not far from where I was headed. Good girl. Had a difficult time of things recently. He didn't elaborate. I didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. We arrived at the street I'd wanted. I paid. I said thank you. He told me in careful English to enjoy the coffee, which I did. I didn't think much about the niece. I was thinking about coffee. But I took his number before I got out, because he'd offered it, and he seemed like a reliable driver, and finding reliable drivers in a new city is a practical matter. Seamus Connolly. Practical to the last. The third time I booked a Grab de l'Aviación, Min came up on the app. Could have been anyone. Saigon has about 40,000 Grab drivers, or something near that, so getting the same man 3 times in 3 weeks is, well, it's possible. Cities do that. I thought nothing of it. About halfway through the ride he mentioned, conversationally, that his niece was working today. The salon was only 5 minutes' walk from the cafe I was heading to. He wasn't suggesting anything, he was just noting it, the way you note things, the way you note things, the way a man fills a car journey with observations. I said something like, right, and looked out the window at the hum we were passing through, all tangled power lines overhead and a woman hosing down the footpath outside of Bombabu Hufel, place that wasn't open yet. I think about that moment, the ease of it. I could have just said thanks and gone to the cafe. I didn't. I said, lead the way then, or words to that effect. And that was the first decision point I walked past without properly looking at it. Her name was Lynn. I'm going to try to describe her accurately, which means not the way a man usually describes a woman he was taken with. She wasn't, she was attractive, fine, but that's not what got me. What got me was her manner. She was competent. That sounds like a strange thing to say about a person, but I mean it as high praise. She was finishing a client's nails when Min introduced us, a woman in her 40s who was reading something on her phone, and Lynn talked to me without neglecting what she was doing, without the client feeling ignored, without making me feel like I was interrupting. She managed 3 things at once and made it look like she was doing one. I've known mechanics who couldn't do that. She was 29. Bright-eyed in a way that wasn't performance, not the eager brightness of someone trying to be liked, more the alertness of someone who watches everything and has opinions about what they see. She laughed at my accent within about 30 seconds of hearing it. Not unkindly, more like she found it interesting, a sound she hadn't encountered before, which, nobody in Limerick has ever found my accent interesting. It's just how people talk in Limerick. The idea that it could be exotic to someone had genuinely never occurred to me. We talked for maybe 20 minutes. Min hovered for a bit, then said he had another booking and left. I stayed a while longer than I'd planned, then went to the cafe, had the coffee, went back to the guest house. I came back the following week. She was the same, neither warmer nor cooler, exactly as she'd been, like she hadn't spent the interval adjusting her presentation. I found that reassuring in a way I couldn't have articulated at the time. I came back the week after that, and then I started coming by more regularly, on days when I didn't have anywhere specific to be, which was most days, now. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for anyone watching this. I had seen the YouTube videos, not these specifically, but there are stories out there. Men who came to Vietnam or Thailand or the Philippines and got taken apart, financially and emotionally, and then sat in front of a camera and explained how it happened. I'd watched a few of them in the bedsit in Dordogne, late at night, the way you watch things you're half preparing yourself for. I knew the patterns, the immediate intensity, the declarations that came too quickly, the requests that arrived just as you decided you trusted them. Lynn didn't fit any of it. The first month, she paid for her own coffee twice before I could get there first. I tried to pick up the bill both times, and she was already done with the payment before I'd reached for my wallet. She seemed, not embarrassed exactly, more mildly resistant to the idea of being treated, like it created an obligation she hadn't agreed to. I found this remarkable. She told me about the German. He'd been here 2 years ago, she said, and she'd liked him well enough, but he'd been in love with his idea of Vietnam, rather than with her specifically, and she'd gotten tired of feeling like a detail in someone else's fantasy. She said she wasn't interested in a Thai boyfriend who just wanted a trophy. That was the phrase she used. A trophy. I've turned that sentence over many times since, because it was exactly the right thing to say to a man like me. Not flattering, not softening, just direct and slightly sharp. The kind of thing that sounds like honesty. And maybe it was honesty. I still don't know, entirely. Maybe both things were true at the same time. Maybe she meant it, and also knew the effect it would have. I'm not sure those are mutually exclusive. 6 weeks went by, then 8. We were, not together, not in any formal sense. But I was thinking about her constantly by week 8, which surprised me. I'm not a man who usually thinks about people constantly. I'm a man who thinks about practical problems and whether the suspension on a DAF lorry is going to hold past the next service. Lynn had somehow become a thing I thought about while I was walking, while I was eating my Signington breakfast, while I was lying under the clicking ceiling fan trying to sleep. The motorbike came up at the end of week 9. She mentioned it the way you'd mention any inconvenience you were managing. Her motorbike had been stolen 3 weeks before I arrived. She'd been taking Grab everywhere, which on a nail salon salary added up. She wasn't asking. She was just noting it, the way Min noted things. I didn't clock the similarity at the time. I offered. She said no. I said I wanted to. She said it was too much. I said it wasn't. She said she'd pay me back. I said there was no need. She accepted 22 million. About 900. A second-hand Honda in reasonable condition, bought through a contact of Min's, Min, who had, come to think of it, been the one who drove us to look at it, who'd inspected it with the gravity of a man who knew what he was doing. Though on reflection, I never asked what expertise he had. Seamus Connolly, who checks every source of information before he trusts a delivery manifest, didn't ask. I want to explain what it felt like to give her that money, because I think it's important, and I don't think men usually explain this part honestly. It didn't feel like giving money to a woman. It felt like solving a problem. She couldn't get to work reliably. I could fix that. It was exactly the logic I'd applied 10,000 times on the N7. A tire needs changing, you change it. A mate needs a lift, you give him one. If a friend from back home had needed €800 to stop missing work because his transport was gone, I'd have done the same. This was the same thing, just in a different currency. That's what I told myself. And the thing is, I'm not sure I was completely wrong. The motorbike was real. She needed it. But the feeling of being useful, of being the man who solved the problem, of being needed in a practical, concrete way, that was also doing something in me that had nothing to do with the motorbike, and everything to do with Dora Doyle, and the 2-ring hob and the bedsit where nobody needed anything from me at all. Min drove us home afterwards. He was in good form, chatty, seemed pleased. I tipped him generously. I remember thinking he'd been very helpful. He had been, just not exclusively to me. At some point in the second month, I stopped thinking of myself as a tourist. I'm not sure when exactly. There wasn't a day I decided it. It was more like the decision made itself while I wasn't paying attention. I moved out of the guest house. I sorted the visa. I started buying groceries instead of eating every meal at plastic stool places. And one morning, I woke up and realized I was making a cup of tea in my own kitchen and listening to the street outside like a man who expected to hear it again tomorrow. That was the moment, I suppose. The visa extension first. An Irish tourist visa into Vietnam gives you 90 days, which sounds like a lot until you're living, rather than visiting. Min mentioned a man who handled extensions, a small office off Nguyen Dam Ninh, Min Khai, nothing formal, just someone who knew the paperwork and the processes. €50, roughly, for the whole thing, done in 2 days. I paid it and thought nothing of it, which is the correct thing to think about. €50 when you're trying to stay somewhere legally and you have a man who can sort it. I mention it only because Min recommended him, and Min recommending things had become a pattern I wasn't tracking. The apartment was on a side street off Levine Sue, 3rd floor. A small balcony that looked out over the rooftops and the power lines. A kitchen with a gas hob that required a particular technique to light without singeing your hand. 910 to 500,000 a month. About C350. For that, I had 2 rooms. A bathroom with hot water that worked most of the time, and the sound of a motorbike repair shop on the ground floor that started at 7 in the morning and finished at what felt like 11 at night. I didn't mind the noise. I'd slept through worse, parked up at service stations on the M6. I settled into a rhythm. Morning walks down to a coffee place on the corner. Proper Vietnamese coffee. Cachet phi su ja. Condensed milk and ice, stronger than anything you get in a cafe in Limerick, and about 30 pence for the cup. Afternoons when Lynn was working, I'd read, or walk further, or sit on the balcony with a 333 and watch the city do what it did. Evenings together 2 or 3 times a week. A Quan in Hue she liked near her cousin's place. In District 4, good grilled pork and cold beer. And sometimes her friends from the salon joining us. 2 women named Theo and Hyung, who treated me with the relaxed curiosity of people who had seen this kind of arrangement before, and had no particular opinion about it either way. I understood fragments of their conversations, those evenings. Not everything, they spoke quickly and used a lot of slang my notebook hadn't covered, but enough to catch the shape of things. My height came up. There was a recurring debate about whether Ireland was part of England or not, which I always wanted to weigh in on, but managed to resist. Nothing alarming, nothing that tightened anything in me. Just the ordinary chatter of women who worked together and saw each other constantly and talked about their lives in the way people do. Then Lynn went to Jingnai. She told me about her mother's knee, the way she told me most things, factually, without preamble, without obvious emotion. Her mother was 61, had been having problems with the knee for over a year, but it had gotten worse recently. She needed to go home for a week, maybe longer, for a hospital assessment. Her younger brother lived with the mother, and he could manage most of it, but Lynn needed to be there. I'd done the arithmetic before she finished the sentence. I know that about myself. It's not a generous impulse exactly. It's more like a logistical reflex, the same one that calculated fuel costs and toll charges and whether a job was worth the drive. I heard the situation, and I ran the numbers, and I said, "Let me help with the hospital costs." She said she had savings. I said I knew she did, but this is what you do when someone you care about needs something. That's just what people do. She accepted. I tracked every transfer in a notes app on my phone, not because I was suspicious, I want to be clear about that, but because I'm a man who kept a logbook for 22 years and the habit doesn't go away. It's just how I'm built. The initial hospital assessment at a private clinic in Bien Hoa is 30,000. About 1,000. The bus down and back 3 times over the following weeks, Prusket, Nian Miniate, Nian 1, prescription medication over a 6-week period, something for the inflammation. I didn't ask for more detail. Nian 17, roughly P630, total across the 6 weeks, approximately 2,000. I went down to Tung Nai one weekend. Lynn had mentioned it half as an invitation and half as a warning. It was a simple house. Her family weren't used to foreign visitors. I shouldn't expect much. I said I didn't expect anything. The house was on a lane off the main road outside the town, low rise, painted a pale yellow that had faded unevenly. A small altar just inside the front door, with a photograph and incense, the smoke still moving when we arrived. The mother was a small woman who moved carefully, with the particular care of someone managing pain they'd learned to work around. She spoke no English. She looked at me with the reserved courtesy of a person who has decided to be polite about something she doesn't fully understand yet. There was nothing performed about it, no warmth engineered for my benefit. Just the slightly stiff dignity of a woman in her own home who doesn't love needing help and is managing that feeling with good manners. I found that genuine. I still do. We ate together, a meal her brother had cooked, rice and fish and something I couldn't identify but ate anyway. The brother, mid-30s, said almost nothing to me directly, but watched me with the measuring look of a man deciding what he thought. By the end of the meal, he'd relaxed slightly, enough to offer me more rice. I took it as a good sign. The salon came up in month 4. Lynn arrived at my apartment one evening, not her usual time earlier, and with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Tense in the way of someone managing a situation they haven't decided how to manage yet. The owner of the salon was in financial trouble. Debts Lynn didn't know the details of. He was going to close. She'd built her client base there over 3 years, the women who came back for her specifically, not for the salon. She knew the suppliers. She knew how to run it. If she could buy a partnership stake, she could protect what she'd built and potentially grow it. She had the ledger. She showed it to me. A handwritten book, 3 months of entries, revenue figures in columns, outgoings, a rough penciled valuation at the back. It looked real. It was real, so far as I could see, though I am a man who can read a delivery manifest and not a man who can audit a small business. I asked Min. This is the part one come back to most when I think about the shape of what happened. I was heading across the city the following day, and I showed Min the ledger figures and explained the situation and asked what he thought. He looked at the numbers with the concentrated seriousness of a man who knew what he was looking at. Good business, he said. Lynn is a smart girl. He had seen worse investments. He looked at those numbers the way I look at a tire. Like a man who knows what he's talking about. I believed him. That was my mistake, not giving Lynn the money, or not just that. The mistake was treating Min as an independent opinion when he was never independent of anything. Do 8 million, Balzen do 6 million, do seg million, do seg million. From my savings, transferred in 2 parts. The repayment arrangement was verbal and vague. She'd pay me back when the business was stable, and whatever amounts made sense. I didn't push for specifics. I told myself I'd done dumber things with money in Ireland, which was true, and that this was a real business with real numbers, which was also true. I sent Phil a voice note that evening, not about Lynn specifically. I described her only as a friend I'd been helping. He said it sounded all right. Enjoy yourself, he said. You've earned a bit of sun. I played that voice note back once, a few months later, standing in a different apartment in a different district. The cheerful certainty of it. Enjoy yourself. You've earned it. Phil wasn't wrong. He just didn't know what I'd been earning. The salon did well. That's the part that made the earning. That's the part that made the house easier to agree to. For the first few weeks after Lynn bought the partnership stake, she was visibly different, energized in a way that had a specific texture to it, like someone who'd been given a problem they were confident they could solve. She talked about the client base, about a supplier she was switching, about a young woman she wanted to bring in to handle the overflow on Saturdays. She showed me the revenue on her phone one evening over dinner at a place on Hoang Diu her cousin had recommended. Grilled pork and rice, 20 minutes on plastic stools, the street loud with motorbikes and the neighbors' karaoke starting up somewhere above us. The numbers looked good, not spectacular, but solid. I watched her explaining them and thought, right, that was a sound decision. So when the house came up about a month later, I was in the frame of mind of a man who'd recently been proven correct about something. That's worth noting. The second visit to Shong Nai was my idea, actually. Or, Lynn suggested it, and I agreed quickly, which amounts to the same thing. The mother's knee had improved with the medication. A new roof had come up in passing once, just mentioned, the way things got mentioned around Lynn. I'd said something vague, and she'd let it go, and I'd thought no more about it. It was her brother who showed me the walls. I don't know if that was deliberate. I genuinely don't. He struck me as a straightforward man, quieter than Lynn, more careful with words, the kind of person who says a thing once and expects it to be heard. We were standing in the side room of the house, and he pointed at a crack running from the floor to about mid-height, not a hairline crack, a proper structural one, the kind I'd seen on old depot buildings outside Port Louise that had been left too long. He brought me outside and showed me the roof section. Plastic sheeting held down with bricks where the original material had failed. It wasn't a performance. It was the specific visual of a house that has been slowly losing its argument with the weather for about 15 years. I've delivered enough construction materials to know what a foundation problem looks like. I want to be clear about that because it matters. The problem was real. I wasn't being shown a problem that had been manufactured for my benefit. I was being shown a problem that existed because the money to fix it had never been there. Later, Lynn raised it carefully. Her family could cover some of it, her brother had savings, and there was money she could put in. But a full roof replacement and foundation reinforcement was beyond them. She wasn't asking him to cover everything. She wasn't presenting it as an expectation or an obligation. She was explaining a situation, and she was leaving a space. I understand that now. She was very good at leaving spaces, not demanding, not pleading, just describing a real thing and leaving room for a person to decide what kind of person they wanted to be. And I decided .NT 30,000. Approximately .NT 30,000. Approximately 2,000 time. My contribution toward a total project cost of roughly 50 million. I transferred it to her brother's account in 3 installments across 5 weeks. As the work proceeded, I watched the first installment go and then checked my savings balance and did the arithmetic. Running total at that point: motorbike, hospital, salon, house, 20,4,800. I still had approximately 63,000 in the account, plus the monthly pension coming in. I was not broke. I was not ruined. But the number had stopped being theoretical. It was real money that was gone, and I was aware of it in a way I hadn't been with any individual item on its own. Here's the part one. Find hardest to explain, and I'm going to try anyway. My back injury ended my ability to do physical work. I'd known that in a practical sense, since the physiotherapy, since the pension paperwork, since the forms. But it took a couple of years to understand it properly, what it actually meant for a man like me. A man who has always been most himself when he's solving something with his hands, or his logistics, or his practical knowledge of how things work. When the work stopped, I didn't just lose a job. I lost the main way I understood my own usefulness. The bedsit in Dooradoyle wasn't just lonely. It was the place where I sat with the knowledge that I couldn't do the thing I'd always done. When I stood in that side room in Lung Nai and looked at the foundation crack, I knew exactly what the problem was and exactly what solving it required. I couldn't mix the concrete myself. I couldn't climb onto the roof. But I could see the problem clearly, and I could fund the solution. And for the first time since the disc gave way on a depot floor outside Nas, I felt useful in the specific way I understood usefulness. That's an honest account of it. The money was almost incidental. What I was buying was the feeling of being a man who could still fix things. I transferred the first installment on a Wednesday. I sat on the balcony that evening with a 333 and watched the sun go down behind the power lines and felt fine, better than fine. I'd done something concrete. A family would have a roof that didn't leak. I'd seen the problem and solved it. The satisfaction of it was real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What came after was quieter, subtler. The kind of thing you'd only notice if you were already looking. Lynn became less available on certain evenings, not often, once or twice a week, sometimes. Something at the salon, she said, or she was tired, or a family call she needed to take. I didn't push. I'm not a man who pushes. But I noticed. Min, when I rode with him, had shifted slightly. He still talked, still answered questions, still pointed out things in the city, but the stories had stopped, or nearly. He used to volunteer things, observations and histories and small pleasures. Now he responded but didn't initiate, and something about that change in register was filing itself away in a part of my brain that I wasn't quite consulting yet. I told myself he was tired. I told myself Lynn was busy. Both probably true, and also possibly something else, and I chose not to look at the something else. Around this time, I switched my Vietnamese study from the YouTube and app approach to a proper tutor. A woman who taught online, 2 sessions a week, structured grammar, and listening exercises and corrections that the app had never been able to give me. My comprehension was by now at roughly 70% of casual spoken Vietnamese. If I concentrated, practical topics, everyday conversation, the kind of exchanges that happen in cabs and restaurants, and between people who aren't being careful about what they say in front of who. I still hadn't told Lynn. I'm not entirely sure why I kept it from her as long as I did. Partly habit, I don't announce things until they're done. Partly something else I can't quite name. Maybe some instinct that the hidden knowledge was worth more as a hidden thing, though I couldn't have told you what I expected to do with it. I was about to find out, 6 months in. Thursday morning. The kind of morning that has no particular character, overcast, the air still carrying last night's heat. The motorbike repair shop starting up below right on schedule. I'd booked Min the night before through the app for a run across the city. A small practical thing I needed to sort, something to do with the apartment lease. A meeting with a man Min knew who could advise on a longer-term visa arrangement. Normal Thursday business. Min was outside at 8 on the dot, medallion on the mirror. Radio on low. He asked if I'd eaten, and I said I'd had coffee, and he said that wasn't eating. We pulled into the traffic on Levine's Shoe, and I sat with my phone in my lap and watched the city move past the windows. Lean called about 20 minutes in. I answered on speaker because my hands were occupied with something on the phone screen. She wanted to know about the weekend. Were we going to Mong Nai? She was thinking of checking on the roof work. The second contractor was due to start. I said, possibly. Let me think about it. We can talk later. Standard exchange, nothing in it. Then she said something in Vietnamese to Min. I caught the shape of it. Money, timing, something about the last transfer. Her tone was easy, the tone of someone talking to a familiar person, about a familiar person, about a familiar subject. Min laughed. And he said, quickly, in the flat register of a man who expects to be understood by only one person in the car, that the roof money was more than enough. More than enough for the next one, too. He said it the way you'd say something obvious. Something that didn't need to be stated carefully. Lin made a sound. I don't have a good translation for it. It wasn't a laugh. It wasn't a rebuke. It was the specific sound of a person who has just been told a joke that was accurate, but slightly too loud, slightly too plain. The sound of someone recalibrating. Then she switched back to English, smooth as anything, warm and easy. She was asking about Saturday. Should she book the bus, or would we drive? She hoped I was eating properly. I always forgot to eat properly. I said Saturday sounded grand. I'd ring her later about the time. Min resumed talking about the traffic on Yongbyon-pyu. Something about a junction that had been bad all week. I let him talk. I am very good at stillness. 22 years of sitting in a cab alone in the dark teaches you that. You can understand something completely and show nothing on your face and just let the road go past. That's what I did. I sat in Min's cab on a Thursday morning and I let the road go past, and I understood what I'd just heard, not in anger. That's what I want people to understand. There was no rage, no dramatic moment of betrayal. It was more like something that had been sitting at a slight angle for weeks, had just settled into its correct position. The load had shifted. That's all. I paid Min at the end of the journey, tipped the same amount I always did, because I didn't want him to know anything had changed. He thanked me the same way he always did. I got out and stood on the footpath, and the city moved around me, and I thought, right. Okay then. Over the following 3 weeks, I did what I'd spent 22 years learning to do with a problem I couldn't fix immediately. I didn't react. I gathered information. I went back to my old guest house in Vientiane, not to stay, just to visit, because there was a South African woman named Karen who'd been living in Saigon for 12 years and who had, on one of my first evenings there, made a dry comment about Grab drivers who introduced their nieces that I'd registered and filed away at the time without examining. I told Karen the outline of what had happened. Not everything. Just enough. She looked at me the way a mechanic looks at you when you describe a noise. The look that means she already knows the diagnosis and is deciding how directly to deliver it. The Min model, she said. It has a name. Driver introduces a woman, niece, friend, colleague. He validates the relationship. He's present at decisions. It doesn't always go this way, but when it does, it goes exactly this way. She wasn't unkind about it. She was just factual, the way you're factual about something you've seen before. I spent several evenings going through Lin's Facebook account, methodical, not emotional, just patient, the way you'd go through a set of delivery records looking for an inconsistency. I went back 2 years in her tagged photos and her check-ins and her connections. I found a Vietnamese man, mid-30s. He appeared in photos going back at least 3 years, at weddings, at family gatherings, in the kind of recurring domestic proximity that doesn't belong to a friend or a colleague. There was no public declaration of anything, but the continuity was there. The kind you can't fake with photo timestamps. I don't have proof in a court case sense. I have enough. I opened the Notes app on my phone, and I looked at the logbook I'd kept from the beginning. The motorbike, Tonchi 800. The hospital, and the medication, and the transport, 55,000, Tonchi that. The salon, Yui 8 million cillion, Yui 10,000. The house, Yui year, 1,000 cillion, 1,000 total. Dao files, total. Total and actual money. I closed the app. I sat on the balcony with the 330 Re and looked at the power lines and thought about what I wanted from a confrontation. The honest answer, and a confrontation would give me either a lie I'd have to decide whether to accept or the plain version of something I already knew. Neither outcome served any purpose I could identify. So I didn't confront her. I became unavailable. It's something I'm reasonably good at. I spent years being not quite reachable in a lorry cab, managing the gap between what people expected and what I could actually give. I said I was under the weather when she called after 10 days. She expressed concern, suggested we meet that weekend. I said yes, and then canceled the morning of. She called again. I said I was still not right. We arranged another time. I canceled again. The third cancellation she didn't rearrange. There was no scene, no confrontation, no accusations, no dramatic phone call in either direction. Whatever it was just stopped. Like a delivery route that quietly gets taken off the schedule. There one week, not there the next. I think about Min sometimes. Not with anger either, strangely. He was doing something that made economic sense to him. He wasn't malicious in the way the word usually means. He was practical. The city required a certain practicality, and he had developed it, and I walked into his cab and I fit the profile of someone he knew how to be practical with. That's an honest account of him too. It doesn't mean what he did was all right. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's more complicated than villains, and the complicated version is more useful to understand. I moved to Binachin about a week after Lynn stopped rearranging. It's a different district, quieter than District 3, fewer expat bars, a wet market nearby that opens at 5 in the morning and smells of herbs and fish and something frying that I still haven't identified. I found an apartment on the third floor of a narrow building on a side street. Smaller than my last place, but with a better view. Across rooftops, a temple about 200 meters away, the smell of incense drifting over sometimes in the evenings when the wind was right. I liked that. I don't know why exactly. It just felt like the city had its own business to attend to, and I was allowed to be nearby without being the point of anything. The weeks after were, a deflation is the right word, not a crisis, not a breakdown. I ate a lot of fun. I walked a lot. I slept badly for about 3 weeks, and then normally again. I made a voice note at 2 in the morning, one night, just talking through what had happened, because I needed to hear how it sounded out loud. That was the first time I'd said any of it to anyone, even if the anyone was just a recording that I listened back to once and then left on my phone. The grief, and it was grief, I'm not going to dress it up as something more manageable, was familiar in structure. I'd been through it before, with Sandra. But the texture was different. Sandra's ending had been slow and public, and surrounded by solicitors and other people's opinions, and the specific indignity of having the worst moments of your life processed through official paperwork. This was fast and quiet, and entirely mine to sit with. Nobody else knew the details. Nobody back home was going to ring and ask how I was. It was a private problem, which is easier in some ways and harder in others. The financial reckoning I'll state plainly, because I want anyone watching this to understand the actual scale of it. DOS 24, 800 gone. Of the roughly 88,000 I'd arrived with, a little more than a quarter, I still have approximately 63,000 in savings. I still have my pension coming in each month, the disability payment, which isn't generous but is reliable, and in Saigon with modest outgoings, it's enough to live on without touching the savings. I am not ruined. I want to be specific about that because I have since met men in this city who lost everything, sold their houses, borrowed against pensions, took second mortgages they couldn't service, and came to Vietnam and lost all of it. Those men have a different story and a different weight to carry. Mine stings. It doesn't cripple me. The distinction matters if you're deciding what to take from it. So what did I lose? The money. Real. Significant. Annoying in the specific way that money is annoying when you know exactly how many hours of physical work it represented and how little of it you have left to earn. The 6 months. Also real. I'm 47. 6 months is not nothing. It's not catastrophic, but it's not nothing. Min. This one surprised me when I named it, sitting in that flat in Bien Thanh Et at 2 in the morning making voice notes. I genuinely liked Min, the cab rides. His observations about the city, the slightly formal English, and the way he'd fill silences without needing anything in return. I missed those rides in a way I hadn't expected to. I find that embarrassing to admit, and I'm admitting it anyway because it's true. And then the thing I've put last, which means it's the hardest one. For 6 months, I felt like someone worth looking at. Not romantically, though that was part of it. More than that. I felt like a person with a future, which is something I'd stopped being in the bedsit in Dorodoyle. I felt undiscarded. Sandra in the back injury and Brendan in the gray suit had together managed to make me feel like a man who had been assessed and found not quite worth keeping. And Lynn, whatever else she was doing and however calculated the whole thing was, had made me feel, temporarily, like that assessment had been wrong. Like I was still someone people chose to be around. Losing that was the hardest part. It's the one I didn't mention first thought now. The Vietnamese. I want to be honest about what it gave me and what it cost me. On the one hand, I understood a sentence in the back of a cab that told me what I needed to know. Without the 4 months in Dorodoyle and the YouTube videos and the tutor's exercises, I'd have been sitting in that back seat hearing pleasant sounds and understanding nothing, and the situation would have continued until it ended some other way, probably worse. The language study did what it was supposed to do. But I'd also mistaken partial understanding for full understanding, and that was its own kind of overconfidence. I knew the words men said. I understood almost nothing about the structure that had been built around me across 6 months. The way the trust had been constructed, and the decisions had been validated, and the spaces had been left for me to fill. That architecture was invisible to me. Understanding 60 or 70% of spoken Vietnamese doesn't tell you how a city operates, how certain networks function, what signals an experienced person would have read long before I did. The language made me feel safer than I was. I want to be straight about that. I'm still learning. 2 sessions a week with my tutor, structured, no secrets about it now. I tell people I'm studying. My Vietnamese is genuinely functional these days. I can negotiate at the market, have real conversations with my neighbors, follow most of what's on television if I concentrate. A few weeks ago, I was at a street food stall on Phan Chi Long, a Ban Quan place I've been going to on Saturday mornings, and I ordered entirely in Vietnamese, specific, correct, the right tones. The woman looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as genuinely startled, and then she smiled. Not the polite smile you give a tourist who manages one word. The real one. The one that means you've been seen doing something properly. It's a small thing. I know it's a small thing. But it's mine. Nobody arranged it. Nobody left a space for me to fill. I just did it. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in any part of what one told you, the divorce, the bedsit, the freedom fund sitting in an account while you're wondering what you're going back to, I'm not going to tell you not to come. I'm still here. But understand what you're carrying before you get on the plane. The loneliness is the vulnerability, not the money. The money is just how the loneliness gets accessed. And the version of you that needs someone to see him, that man will be visible to people who know how to look, regardless of how prepared you think you are. Learn the language. Not to catch people out, though that happens too, but because it closes the gap where that version of you lives. Min didn't know I'd started learning Vietnamese. He should have checked. That's the whole story, really. That's where we leave Seamus Connolly. Still in Saigon, still in the language classes, still at the Saturday Bandicoot install. What I want you to take from this story, and it's different from most of the stories we tell on Inside Vietnam, is the outcome type. Seamus didn't lose everything. And the reason he didn't lose everything isn't luck. It's that somewhere underneath 6 months of hoping and spending and willfully not looking at things too carefully, he retained the thing that ultimately mattered, his own counsel. His ability to sit in the back of a cab, hear something terrible, and think clearly without flinching or performing. A lot of men in his position would have confronted Lynn in the heat of that Thursday morning, or called Phil, or done something dramatic that made them feel like the protagonist of their own betrayal. Seamus did none of those things. He went quiet in the way he'd always gone quiet when there was nothing useful to say, and he let the road go past, and he gathered his information, and he made his exit without a scene. There is dignity in that. And there is wisdom, if you're willing to learn from it. I want to say something about Vietnamese family obligation because this story touches on it. The mother's knee was real. The house was structurally compromised. These were not manufactured crises. In Vietnamese culture, the expectation that a partner contributes to family needs, to parents' health care, to the family home, is genuine and deep, and has nothing inherently manipulative about it. Westerners who arrive here without understanding that will always be caught off guard because they'll experience normal cultural expectations as escalating demands. The problem isn't the expectation. The problem is not understanding it clearly enough to know when it's genuine and when it's being used as a mechanism. The Min model is the part one want to flag specifically, the friendly intermediary. The driver, the fixer, the man who always knows someone who can help. He validates the relationship, he confirms the financial decisions, he builds trust by being present without ever appearing to push. This is one of the most under-discussed mechanisms in expat exposure, and it's not always malicious. Sometimes it really is just a man connecting people in a way that happens to benefit him. But it is almost always present, and it should always be examined. If you're in Vietnam or thinking about going, or if you're watching this from a bedsit somewhere telling yourself it's just the sun, understand what you're carrying before you get on the plane. Seamus did. He came with a notebook and 4 months of tones and the intention of not being the clueless Thai. He just didn't understand quite yet that preparation and awareness are not the same thing as being protected. They rarely are. Inside Vietnam, stay curious. Stay careful. Seamus did. Stay curious. Stay careful.